right?
Well, welcome everyone. I am Mark Amender. I'm an adjunct professor here at the journalism school. I first met Chuck back in 2005 when he recruited me away from ABC News because he wanted to create, at the time, was an innovative digital product. Remember, we were the first at The Hotline, which was a political newsletter in Washington. We wanted to create an online blog that was devoted only to reporting, reported only, basically. And analysis.
But updated hourly.
Updated hourly. And I think we were the first to do, the first national publication to do that, I think.
Yeah, now there all goes. It's called Twitter.
Now,
but anyway,
yeah.
It's not that innovative anymore. But I swear to God, it seemed innovative at the time because it was.
Right. And then Chuck went on to bigger and better things. He went to NBC, was the chief White House correspondent, and as you know, he is now the moderator and host of Meet the Press and the political director of NBC News. So we're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to ask some questions and then open it up to questions from all of you. I know this is a
very
large
monitor.
Yes.
Everything in California is slightly bigger. We don't have a monitor this big.
You know, it's interesting that we're here in this hall because on election night in 2016, I was in there with students, and the sense that I felt from a lot of students who were out here was shock. But it was the first time for a lot of students, they kind of felt that they were part of history and not just living above it. And feelings changed in ways, for many people, not positive, although there are plenty of Trump supporters on this campus, and I've talked to many of them, but just the feeling of what it's like to be someone who's engaged in politics changed. And I'm wondering what it's like as a journalist, before saying nothing so much about good or bad, but what does it feel like to be a journalist in this age in Washington?
Well, let me just say it this way. I got into political journalism. I started in 1992. That was my first election cycle. And that was an amazing election cycle to start. In 1992, we had the first real three-way presidential race. We had a third-party candidate in Ross Perot that led for most of the summer. And it was the first time I worked at a publication where we did this innovative thing. We said, you know, people are going to want to track how the Electoral College is going. And at the time, nobody covered state polls. And this was my first taste of politics. I'm like, this is great. And I remember my boss at the time going, we're never going to see something like this again. And I say that because I'm always concerned about, you know, assuming that being in the present means it's the most significant and important moment in history, or that, you know, sort of recency bias is a phrase that sports is a huge problem with it, recency bias, but it can happen sometimes with us politically. And I think about that when I get questions like that, because I thought 1992, man, what a presidential election. We're never going to see anything like that. 2 years later, for the first time in 40 years, the House of Representatives changed hands. 4 years later, we have our first impeachment in over 100 years. Remember, Nixon never was impeached. In 2000, the craziest ending to an election. It was an election that everybody realized their vote mattered after it was over. But we have that. 9/11 was a singularly historic and pivotal moment in this country. In 2008, we have the first African-American president. So my point is, and then 2016, we have the first sort of celebrity president. Or product of social media, or whatever we want to call this. But I think we will have a label for Trump. Historians will have him in a category that is more about celebrity, I think, at some point, or fame as we go forward, sometime during the Taylor Swift administration. Thank you. I think somebody was, I try to throw in some laugh lines in there, except I'm not sure, I might be.
You're good.
That might be the future. My point is that it has been an incredibly the last 25 years, you could make a case that we've had actually a very tumultuous politics. And that's actually what I'm trying to remind students of and myself of all the time, is that this is an era. I do think historians in 50 years will look back at, and they will say, boy, this has been they will label a period. It may be 1992 to 2008, maybe 1992 to 2020, but this period of sort of tumult, turn of the century, they'll use the technological explosions, the turn of the century aspect, the fact that there's globalization happening at the same time. We're in the middle of a transition in our economy from industrial to whatever the hell we're calling this, global, service sector, the Uber economy was hip a few years ago. We went through this 100 years ago. You know, if you go back 100 years and you go, say, from like 1896 elections to, say, 1932, we had a lot of tumultuousness around the globe, and it had to do, arguably, you could say at its core, it was this economic sort of transition, then it was agrarian to this. I guess I just hope it doesn't take us 2 world wars, a Russian Revolution, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which is what happened in that 40-year period. Let's hope it does before we sort of figured out a more stable normal. Let's hope it doesn't take us a couple of world wars to get through this transition. I'm slightly more optimistic that we'll avoid a world war. But I do think that we sort of have to look at Trump as a symptom of a larger tumult and a larger issue with our economy, a larger issue with social change, and we can go through various aspects of it. But I think the thing we don't study enough, and we don't appreciate enough, is how much social media has changed human behavior. Not politics, not the media, human behavior. And I think until we sort of come to grips with that.
And we're just at the beginning.
And we're just at the beginning of this.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm somebody who's binged Black Mirror, and I'm afraid for my life, for the future. But I almost, you know, I made Black Mirror mandatory for my 14-year-old daughter. I want people to see, like, the extremes of technology taken to its dystopian end, how it, you know, in order for us to start figuring out, we've got to create some cultural guardrails on social media. And I think it's self-governance. I don't think it's going to be I don't think it's something you can expect to come from government, some sort of regulation. It's going to have to be some sort of societal norm that we decide in some ways collectively what's out of bounds and what isn't. Because if we don't, I mean, social media is ripping politics apart. And let's not pretend it's not. It is absolutely, I think, at its core, and it's why we're in this space that we're in right now politically.
How have you changed your social media habits in the past couple of years?
I would say I've changed a lot. I loved it. I saw it as an outlet to finally spew about other things.
And also,
like everybody else, politics, culture.
Interact with
viewers. It's an opportunity to cover stories that I don't necessarily can't put on air. I see it, there's all sorts of, and I love Twitter as a wire service. I mean, you know, I remember the first time I was able to hack into the AP 50-state wire with an illegal passcode in the 90s, and I was ecstatic because it was just an IV of news into my veins. And now Twitter is that times a trillion. So I love so many aspects of it, but I'll tell you, I am more guarded than I've ever been on social media, just personally. I also feel as if that it's just, there are campaigns to sort of try to make us the story. I don't want to be the story. I don't want us to be the story. When we're the story, when we in journalists are the story, it's because the people we're covering want us to be the story, and we got to ask ourselves, why do they want us to be the story? Because there's something they don't want out there. And we can't take bait, right? And that's the hardest part, because the last time I checked, I'm a human being. I have feelings. I can lose my cool. I can lose my temper, all those things. I don't criticize, or I empathize with people, with my colleagues, when you want to just emote on social media to respond to what you feel as if an attack on the First Amendment or an attack on our integrity. But you're following into a trap at the same time when you do that sometimes, and you're making yourself the story, and you're potentially, what you're trying to save, you're actually covering. The message you're trying to send is getting lost. And I think so in that way, that's how I've changed I have done a lot. I'm less interactive than ever. I still use it, but I use it as a push, and then I'm a lurker. But the interactivity is much less, and it's only because there seems to be there's nothing but penalty.
Right.
You know, you let your guard down a second, and you know, suddenly suddenly I've given NBC a headache that they didn't deserve.
There is something though on top of that, which is, previous presidents have had in private expressed enormous frustration with the media. George W. Bush had a few choice words on a mic for Adam Clymer.
Adam Clymer, by the way.
Yeah.
He was a reporter for the New York Times.
I mean, you know where I'm going with this.
I am, and George W. Bush whispered and it got caught on the hot mic. Boy, he's a major league a-hole. He didn't use A. Well, anyway, when Trump called me a sleepy-eyed SOB a couple weeks ago, Adam reached out to me and he says, he says, I never had it on Twitter.
I don't see.
And I said, yeah, buddy, Twitter's a whole nother animal than what you had to do with.
Fair point. But you've actually talked about this in relation to its effect on, you have a family, you have people. Mm-hmm. How do you not let it affect yourself? What do you tell people about it? One thing that's interesting is you insist that your children have respect for the institution of the presidency.
Sure. I look at it this way. I was raised in a bipartisan household, and I think that's why I think without that experience, a bipartisan household where my parents talked about the fact that they canceled each other's vote out. It was I did get raised in a household that talked a lot about politics, and it was central there. And my father very much believed in making sure I had a wide aperture for politics. He'd sit me in front of both conventions, and he'd point out important speakers, and he'd say, I don't agree with the speaker, but he's very important, and here's why you should listen to it. It was sort of it was always that mindset that he had this idea that, look, I'm going to expose him to some of the ideas I believe in, but also the ideas I don't believe in, and that's part of your education. He was also somebody that subscribed to National Review and the New Republic, and I remember asking him once, and he said, this is in the 80s, when the New Republic was a liberal intellectual sort of counterpoint to National Review. It's a slightly different magazine today. Just more of a culture piece, I guess, is what you might call it. And he'd say, well, you got to understand the arguments on both sides, which is, you know, it's sort of a no duh when it comes, you say that at a learning institution. I have avoided, look, when you live in the Washington, D.C. area, it's a company town. The way Hollywood's probably a company town around here, politics is a company town around there. And everybody works in the industry in some form or another. And my daughter was getting harassed by who's your dad voting for, Romney or Obama? Is he a Democrat or a Republican? And one day, a parent told me that my daughter told their son, well, he's a Democrat and a Republican. And I thought, man, what a great answer.
Well, you used to tell us at the hotline to consider ourselves bipartisan, not nonpartisan.
Nonpartisan, that's right.
Yeah.
I did believe that, meaning that, you know, it is important to understand what there isn't a neutral, it's hard to sometimes be neutral. There is no such thing as sort of a purist neutrality, I think, in some of these debates. But I still demand that. You know, if I hear my kids making fun of the president because it's become an easy thing to do in elementary schools and middle schools, I tell them I don't want to hear that. You don't denigrate that. But the day he called me an SOB, I'm at dinner with my kids. My daughter's phone blows up, along with mine, because her friends are a little bit older, a little more. And then my son got really upset. He goes, why does the president not like you? And I said, he's just joking. He's just joking. Don't worry about it. And that's how you try to blow it off. But it is sort of the part of this where it's like, if I could have the president alone, I would say this is This is the tension you create. This is the pressure you're putting on all of us. And by the way, it's not just a journalist. I mean, imagine what Jeff Sessions' family must feel like, right? Here's this guy who they thought was this conservative icon, and the president belittles him all the time. You know what I mean? It's the same. So you're sort of like, you're really putting pressure on people that, in ways that it's not going to make you look good. Well, it you know, he doesn't care, obviously, but look, it does require that we have to grow thick skin. One of the decisions I made a couple years ago when I took this job is when I realized that people are going to make a judgment about you simply based on the fact that there's a peacock on the screen when I appear. And they will decide what that means, what they think of me, just based on that. They're not going to actually research what I've reported, what stories I've done. You know, it's a knee-jerk because they belong to another tribe, right? And they are told in that tribe that that tribe is the enemy, and it doesn't matter. And they're a member of that tribe, so forget it. So I do think that all of us in journalism have to realize we're not here to be popular. And I do think that for a small, short period of time, and we have some colleagues that he knows who I'm referring to, there were too many people in our business that were concerned about what people thought. And that's what leads to access journalism. That's what leads to, you know, those sort of things where you feel like the appearance that the press and the powerful were getting a little too cozy. I don't care if people hate me. Obviously, I hope they do it on the merits. I hope, you know, meaning like I hope they research, you know, I'd like to think if they didn't, they wouldn't think I was a despicable human being. But my point is that I cannot let that impact the job that I do. And that's something that you just have to sort of learn to live with. Or if you don't like it, leave, and that's okay. I can tell you this, I can't imagine doing this job 20 years. I'm not gonna, Tim Russer did it 18. You know, I promise you I'm not doing this job 18 years. I mean, right now, I mean, my God, 1 week feels like a month as far as lifespan is concerned. So we are accelerating past dog years.
In a couple of dog years, we have the midterms. What are some smart metrics that people who are covering the midterms should look to see, or at least have a sense of what the major stories are going in? Not whether Democrats are going to take control, but what should people be looking at who are covering this?
Look, I've never felt so uncertain about what the fall's going to look like this late in a midterm cycle, because it is April. We know what the Republicans can't run on. They wanted to run on the tax cut. It ain't going to happen. They know that. They're looking for something else to run on. Democrats are obviously sort of having I think a debate. Whether they're not having the actual debate, but you sort of see it play out in campaigns. About half the candidates think it's run against Trump, and the other half that says ignore them and go kitchen table. You know, only talk issues, only talk health care. And I think it's because right now, I can tell you this, if you're in a primary, all you talk about is Trump. Whether it's a Republican primary, it's about how much you love him. In a Democratic primary, it's how much you hate him. Trump is your primary issue if you're in a competitive primary. But we don't know how big of a role Trump's going to play. I mean, I think part of it, Trump's the weather. So in some ways, you know, that's what you're running. You can't change the weather. So you got to realize, if you're a Republican, you got to figure out how you're going to run under these circumstances. And if you're a Democrat, it should give you, if you look at what the Virginia governor's race, and I could tell you a lot of us thought that Ralph Northam, the Democratic candidate, was not using Trump enough. And they made the calculation that Trump was the weather, and we can talk about, like, Trump's always there, but we can talk about issues that Trump's against. But if you talk about issues, so he talked a lot about health care. in a campaign that had nothing to do with health care, but part of it was he was always in a doctor's lab coat, which was smart, because it gave the visual. He always, every one of his I approve messages was always him in a lab coat. And people were like, oh yeah, I voted for him because of health care. He had never actually talked that much about health care, but it was that perception. But it turned out to work. The turnout was already there. Democrats were already fired up. Independents were already fired up to vote against the Republicans to punish them on Trump. So I do think if you're a Democrat, you can count on some of that. But I think it's possible that Trump could run on a negative message that actually works for the base turnout. And he could run on impeachment. And he could run, and I think it's very real. I believed it 6 months ago, and now the Times has been reporting the last couple of weeks that there's some people talking about it, where he could say, you vote for, if the Democrats get control of Congress, they're taking me out. And he makes it about him. Well, his people are devoted to him. They're not devoted to an ideology, and they're not devoted to a party. That 35 to 40% that he has a hold on, it's him. And they view him as sort of this, the savior, the elixir, whatever it is, and they and they made their, and by the way, these voters, most of them will sit here and say, I know he's kind of crooked, and I know he's this, and I know he's that, but he's my crook, and it was my way of keeping the Clintons out of this thing, and he's going to shake it up, and he's my middle finger to you, and it is a necessary evil. That's why we're doing this. So they've already sort of rationalized his bad behavior into the, so that it's, I don't know how much more new information about what he does impacts that vote, because they will tell you they've already, they know that information. They made the decision anyway, and they viewed it as corrupt Clintons, corrupt Trump. They'll take the new corruption over the old corruption, right? That's what they'll tell you, no matter what people in here think about the Clintons. That's what that 35 to 40%. But we have seen a lagging Republican turnout in all these special elections. And if you make this about, are you with them or against them? I don't think it saves the House for the Republicans, but I think it saves the Senate. You look at the places the Democrats need to hold on to, if they win in Arizona, Nevada, and Tennessee, they still have to hold on in places like North Dakota, West Virginia, and Missouri. That Trump message will work in those places.
At least in one of those places.
North Dakota, West Virginia, and all they need is, two. They flipped two of those Democratic red states that Trump carried, and there's really no path for Democrats to win control of the Senate.
We talk about the, sort of the old corrupt and the new corrupt. What happens in 2020 if Donald Trump is still running and the crop of Democratic candidates is virtually unknown to the national public? It's Kamala Harris and Eric Garcetti are two local favorites, but how does that change the dynamics of a 2020 race when Trump can't run against the Clintons, and let's assume that he's not impeached and he's going forward, or not even Trump? I mean, it's more.
I think it's more of like what does this Democratic primary look like? Yeah. Look, I think it's going to be go back and look at the 2016 Republican primary, and it's going to feel very similar to the 2020 vibe. A whole bunch of Republicans ran in 2016 because they believed Hillary was beatable, that literally anybody could beat her, right? Democrats didn't realize this, but Republicans believed it, and guess what? Anybody did beat her. I mean, you could make it, like, who was on paper their weakest major candidate, and yet he still won too? Does anybody think Marco Rubio wouldn't have beaten her now, in hindsight? Or Ted Cruz, or John Kasich, or the numbers may have been different, but it's clear there was a higher percentage of people that were determined never to vote for her. I do think Democrats knew it. Had they looked, they didn't want to believe it. And that's just I think that's a case of head in their sand a little bit. So I think you're 2020. I think everybody who thinks Trump's going to be viewed that vulnerable, and anybody who's ever had an interest is going to go, and you're going to have a mayor of LA, a former mayor of New Orleans, a governor of Montana, plus your Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. I assume both don't run, that only one does, but that. And the question is it a race to the left? And if it is, just like there was a race to the right, there will be an empty lane. So Donald Trump created his own lane, right? And he became he made sure no one could get to his right on immigration, And then he just became but then he sort of adopted whatever outsider position would flummox his opponents.
He mocked Republican
Yes.
orthodoxy in debates, and everyone loved it. The early
Everyone loved
debate.
it.
Yeah. Republican orthodoxy.
And the question is there room for a Democrat to do something similar if there is this sort of uniformity move to the left with the opportunity to stand out, right? Now, is it some celebrity that tries to be the person that stands out, or quasi-celebrity? You know, like a Mark Cuban, although I less think that he sort of fits this bill. You know, I don't laugh at the Dwayne Johnson stuff. You know, I highly doubt it, but why laugh at it? And certainly, I believe
We don't laugh at his movies.
And we don't. The Schwarzenegger School for Public Policy. I am on that campus, right? So,
Yeah.
right. I could guarantee you, 30 years ago, somebody might have laughed at the idea of Arnold Schwarzenegger being governor, and now, the Schwarzenegger School of Public Policy right here on the campus of USC. And I say this is not anything negative about Governor Schwarzenegger. It's just, I think it's the reality that we live in. Does a Michael Bloomberg, is there room for a center moderate, a more centrist Democrat, if they're the only ones trying to be a centrist, suddenly, and you finish second in all of these places, and you're sort of suddenly you have more delegates than everybody else because the progressives are all splitting the field. I also believe that it's likely the nominee, we're not even talking about the candidate who will be the nominee, meaning it could be somebody that wins in 18. I don't think Ted Cruz can lose, but if that guy Beto O'Rourke beats Ted Cruz in Texas, I guarantee you he's going to have a political consultant and a major donor go to him, keep running. Why not? If you could win in Texas as a senator in 18, why can't you win the presidency in 20, right? If the state of Florida elects its first woman governor in history, and it's a woman by the name of Gwen Graham, daughter of a former U.S. senator and governor there, all of a sudden they have one of the preeminent swing state with a female governor. And this, you know, my point is that I think that's how fluid 2020 is, that there are people that aren't yet being seen as presidential candidates who, after this cycle is over in 8 months, you'll look to and like, well, if we're considering Garcetti, who's, frankly, a weak mayor system, right? He's never really had to develop his own policy. If he is considered a major candidate, why can't a newly elected governor in 2018 be considered a serious presidential candidate? So I think it's, I think I think there's, you know, somebody in here can file. I think the Democrats are looking for new, and they're so looking for new that they'll shop around on a lot of candidates for a while.
You see, on the Republican side, Marco Rubio had a weird op-ed today where he seems to be trying to recast conservatism as America First conservatism in an effort to capture Trump voters without what people don't like about Trump. Do you think Republicans will do that, or how do you run as a Republican in a primary against Donald Trump?
Well, I don't think you will. I think what Marco Rubio is doing, and is what same thing Tom Cotton's doing, I think they're trying to be prepared for the post-Trump world, which is, what does conservatism look like when Trump leaves? And I think Rubio is trying to establish himself as the person that decides that now that Ryan's gone, and you know he's not there. So I think Rubio is hoping to sort of somehow bridge that Ryan-Trump divide and be that guy. We'll see. I mean, Cotton wants to, I think Cotton will be a little farther to the right than Rubio, but I think he is trying to. So I think that's what this is about. Rubio just hired a new chief of staff from a conservative think tank called Heritage Action.
Yeah.
And I think he is all about figuring, he's preparing for the 2024 Republican primary against Mike Pence. That's what he's preparing for. And Nikki Haley.
We are at a school that assumes that journalism is going to exist beyond 5 years, but what do you think journalism looks like in 5 years? Actually, let me qualify that. What is political journalism like in 5 years?
Look, I guess I don't know if the thing that's changed the most is speed and interest. All right, there was a time that processed stories about politics, it was a small group of people that were interested in, you know, oh, who's laying the groundwork for a campaign in 18 months? Now there's just a wider interest in it, right? Because you have that, you have more people reporting process than reporting on politics through the prism of policymaking. So, and that's not going to go away.
Right.
I guess I just, here's the challenge for journalism overall. We live in a time where all we want is something that saves us time, right? We just want, right? And so, unfortunately, that's not worked very well in following political news, because if you just follow Twitter headlines, you only know the stereotypes of each party, the stereotypes of every position, the stereotypes of every debate. You don't know the nuance, and the nuance gets lost. To me, if we can figure out how to put nuance in 140 characters, or put nuance in the I hate this word snackable, right? But it's such a stupid tech term about, you know, the small bites, whether it's a 30-second entertainment, whatever it is, your snackable content. You know, this idea of when you have 5 minutes, or I'm boring you right now and you're looking at your phone, you get a snackable content. I'm just kidding. But my point is, it's that downtime. No, my point is that quick look at your phone, right? That is where so many companies are trying to figure out how to get you to look at them for when you have 30 seconds of extra time. The great challenge for us in journalism is how to figure out how to make journalism snackable without being a stereotype, without mischaracterizing the larger story. Because I would say that the thing that's been taken advantage of, right, it's like what's missing, it's all nuance. Like you watch the most extreme versions of cable television where one might be pro-Trump and one might be anti-Trump. There's actually, the facts are the first things that go, you know, and the nuance is gone. That to me is like, I think there is going to be consumer demand for this. But figuring out how to curate without leaving it to a robot, and how to do nuance without leaving it to a robot. I don't think journalism will get AI'd. I know a lot of people think AI is going to, artificial intelligence. I think if it goes to journalism, we've lost, and society's lost.
Let's open this up to questions from students. We have a mic runner here, and just to remind you, questions are interrogatives, and they usually end with an up inflection, so at least you put your voice up if you're asking them. And
I am curious where you're from.
And tell us.
By the way, tell me where you're from.
Yeah, tell us where you're from, sir.
I'm Rob. I teach at the next school over in the architecture school, so I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask questions.
Why not?
Why not? How do you get people to watch news that doesn't just reinforce what they already believe? You talked about tribes earlier, and that sort of alludes to just a reinforcement.
I guess I look at I look at it this way. It's sort of it's my job to go there. It's our job to go where people are getting. So if we feel like 40% of the country's not coming to us, and I have about 40% of the country's not looking at Meet the Press on Sundays, well, how can I get into their feeds? How do I push my content over there in some way? How do I figure out how to have different, so that they say to themselves, all right, I will check this out, right? Some of it is how we market the show sometimes, right? Or how you market what's there for people. But I think that is, you know, this is where there's no great answer other than I'm trying to go to different places. I might go to a podcast, try to myself spend time demystifying the mainstream media, right? Demystifying the supposedly liberal bias media. I think we shouldn't be afraid. Look, the reason why the idea of liberal bias took hold is that there is a cultural bias in the media, okay? You cannot deny a cultural bias in the media because it's based in New York City. And I can tell you where the cultural bias is real, and it's from there that it's been exploited, that it's harmed us from there. Where there's real cultural bias is on the issue of religion, okay? In New York, you live and breathe in New York, you don't know many people that go to church once a week, let alone twice a week. And if you live in the South, you don't know many people that don't go to church at least once a week, let alone twice a week. Yet, to somebody that's born and raised in New York, And you hear that, you're like, oh, Jesus freak. To my brother-in-law, who grew up in Pensacola, he's just like, well, Wednesdays, that's just potluck night, and, it's a community event. It's not church. And then it's like, wait, who are you to, you know nothing about who we are, So the real cultural bias that I think was there in New York in the 80s and 90s, particularly on religion and some social issues, death penalty, and abortion, I would say, are the two biggest ones back then. I think that is what allowed the idea of oh, well, it's bias on everything else. Then you have a bias on everything else. I think that's what made it easier to sell that, right? That's what it made it easier to do that. So I do think that as sort of I try to widen the aperture so that I get a larger chunk of people at least considering open-minded to watching what we have on Meet the Press on Sundays, or maybe reading something that we wrote, or maybe listening to a podcast. But at least if you acknowledge some of those things, I've noticed that if I do talks, and I'll literally be in a conservative, geographically in a conservative area, and people go, oh, I'd never watched you. I just assumed you were X. And you're like, yeah, that's the problem, right? And it's just sort of, it's not an easy answer. That's my point. You have to actively do that, and not everybody. There are plenty. The fact is that there are plenty of journalists who just want to stay within their cocoons too often. And look, it's what got us all in trouble in 2016. Way too many of us covering this from 30,000 feet and not on the ground.
Hi, Chuck.
Hi.
I'm Erin. I'm from New York. I was lucky enough to be an intern for MSNBC during the election period, and was
16 or yeah?
16, yeah, for news gathering. That was really intense.
Mm-hmm.
My question is more about how, obviously, it's no surprise that Trump is like a very emotional tweeter. And my question is, in 2018, do you think that more candidates are going to go towards being more emotional tweeters, or do you think they're going to stay with more of a traditional PR written out tweets?
Look, I think it's interesting. It's a good question. I can tell you this right now. Most political consultants, when they're asked, how do I appeal to the Trump voter? That's usually the first or second answer they give to candidates now, is do something symbolic. Do something a little over the top. My favorite sort of symbolic ad on this, there's a primary taking place in Indiana for the U.S. Senate. A couple of members of Congress, neither one of them were big Trumpers. Mike Pence was practically a never-Trumper himself, okay? And Indiana Republicans are not Donald Trump Republicans. They just culturally never have been. Yet this guy wants to prove he's more Trump than his other opponent, so he just put an ad and he puts on the red MAGA hat, So that's a form of look at me, make America great again. And it's because he was a never-Trumper, and he got caught saying, he got caught saying what most people in polite society believed was vulgar and all that stuff. And so he happened to point that out, and that is a anti-Trump viable defense in a Republican primary. So I do think there is something to it but I don't think it'll be as rewarded as they think it is. I do think that look at how we are with Trump's tweets. I try to make sure that we don't cover them. Like yesterday morning, for instance, I said, boy, the president's issued all these tweets. More than half of them are on call me. Is this thing getting to him? I didn't allow any individual tweet at the time to try to dominate the conversation. So I do think we have finally figured out a way to at least calibrate how we cover it. And I struggle with this. There's a president of the United States, and his words should matter wherever he utters them. But at the same time, we got to cover it in context, not overcover, but also not undercover. I guess I do think you're going to see a lot of that. I don't think it's going to be voter. Here's what we've noticed with the voters. Anytime somebody has tried to be like Trump, they get punished. They don't get rewarded. Marco Rubio? How about James Comey? Right? A lot of people, wait a minute, dude, you're supposed to be Elliot Ness, and you're making hands jokes? Right? It goes back to what The bar for Trump is lower. We have to realize the country made they knew they have a lower bar for him. They hold me to a higher standard. They hold Comey to a higher standard. And so that is something that I think that we have to, and that would be what I would tell a candidate. You're not going to be held to his standard. You're being held to your own standard, so think about that.
That was a good question.
Hi, Chuck. I was born in Armenia, lived in Moscow as a child, and came here when I was 9. And
You must have strong feelings about Erdogan and Putin, but that's all right.
Yeah. And I, too, have a lot of attention and curiosity about technology and social media and what it's doing about what it really fundamentally means to be human and engage with the world. And I'm wondering, where is the technology and social media progression? How can we use that as an advantage and a benefit to information and sharing, as opposed to people being more distracted and more polarized in their beliefs because there's so many outlets for whatever it is you believe?
This to me is the hardest question to figure out. It essentially goes back to what it sounds like you're picking up when I said, we've got to figure out how to regulate our use of social media, not just regulate social media, but it's almost like we have to decide to come up with a societal code of conduct, right? Without the government telling us what that is. You know, it's our collective moms and dads saying, you know, this much social media time is good, this much social media time is bad. I mean, and I don't want to also sound like a Neanderthal, like, you know, my parents would say, geez, are you watching TV too much? I think I turned out okay. I don't think I watched too much TV, but then again, they did try to put, I mean, we have to figure out how to put, I think, limits in how we use it right now, because I just don't think we don't realize how much it consumes us and how much it consumes our day. And maybe we ought to ask ourselves, you know, why don't we appreciate alone time anymore? And I mean, there's something about this machine that makes us, I mean, people don't sit alone in a room like this anymore and read. Instead, they think, well, if I've got 10 minutes, I'll just go in here and check email, or maybe I'll look on social media. And so this is where I struggle, because I think social media goes back to, it's fundamentally changed us as human beings. It's changed our cultural habits. It's changed sort of like, you know, instead of being 6-toed, we're 5-toed. I mean, you know, it has been that sort of environmentally fundamental. And until we accept that, then I don't know how we do these. Because I just, this idea of trying to figure out, I certainly don't want Mark Zuckerberg in charge of it, right? I don't know, and I certainly don't want the government trying to lurk over his head to do it either. I don't trust either one of them. I guess it's some self-governance, and I don't know how we put that. I mean, I think part of it we got to figure out how to teach it, right? We got to figure out how to teach our kids how to use it. In the same way we teach people how to read. I was taught as a kid how to read a newspaper. Now, I don't think, you know, that's different, but you were taught like how to read a news story, how to read a newspaper, how to act, how to conduct yourself in social media. In the same way you're taught, you shake your hand when you meet somebody, you say please and thank you. It's like we have to figure out a societal code of conduct on this, and who starts that conversation? See, that's it, right? In a society that doesn't trust its leaders, in a society that doesn't trust major institutions, who leads the conversation? So, I'm sorry to answer your question with more questions, but I think you see where, I think we all see with the problem that we're at.
Sure.
I am a retired radio journalist out of San Diego.
Oh.
Never had a staff like you and Rachel and Chris Matthews have. And I'm interested, how do you feel about having that research staff available to you, and how much homework do you actually do?
Well, it's funny you say that. Everybody that works for me's number one complaint is that I don't delegate enough. And learning to trust your staff is actually the hardest thing. It's funny, the hardest transition for me from, I'll call it print. It's just a non-television now, whatever we call non-video journalism, right? Non-audio video journalism, all digital printed word journalism. The biggest struggle I had was learning to trust others with research and learning to trust others. So it's an interesting, so for me, it's, and Mark will tell you this, it's sort of, I start out trust but verify, and I do a lot of verifying early on when people work for me. And then as I build more trust, then there's more comfort that you get. But it is funny you say that. I still much prefer sometimes to do my own research. No offense to the young person that might be able to get the job done too. I know I'll get it done faster. Now that said, if I do that, and I know exactly where I think the right answer is. But then how are they ever learning? You know, so it is this balance, and I do, if I want to be able to do 2 or 3 other things that I'm doing, you've got to learn to do that. But it's actually been a very difficult, it is sometimes harder to use a staff, not easier. You would think, but think about it, right? Probably think about your own trust level. What does it take for you to trust somebody else's research and you go on the air with it, right? And so, because I always remind people, I don't care. I'm the one who's going to get hired or fired for this. So I'm very mindful of it, put it that way. And it took a long time for me to build trust with those individuals.
Hey, Chuck Todd. So I have a 2-part question for you, and I actually hate when students do this, but I'm going to do it to you anyways.
I asked Obama a 4-parter one.
Oh, well, there you go.
And he lectured me about it.
So you mentioned earlier that your viewers have a hard time watching you without associating you with that peacock. So my question for you is, one, when you watch someone on the opposite end of the TV spectrum, let's say John Roberts at Fox, can you watch John Roberts and watch his report, being able to separate it from the audience he's reporting from? And my second question to that is, a lot of times you'll see reporters and journalists on their Twitter profiles say these tweets do not reflect NBC. You, on the other hand, actually have like a throwback NBC logo as your Twitter profile. So tell me a little bit about why you chose to do that.
Well, I did that because I didn't want my face on it. I'll be honest. And I did at the time. Look, I don't pretend that what I'd say or do isn't going to reflect on NBC, whether NBC likes it or not, or whether I like it or not. We're intertwined. I'm well aware of that. So I sort of embrace that intertwine. I'm proud of the legacy of NBC. NBC has always had a deep legacy when it comes to covering American politics. It's just, whether David Brinkley and the convention. So I just sort of, I'm just kind of a geek in that way. The reason I do the logo is I like the family tree that goes from David Brinkley to Tim Russert to the fact that I get to do this. So that's sort of my own, I'm just admitting my own sort of fanboyish aspect of it. My mom, I remember we didn't have a TV until I was about 7 or 8, and my mom was just like, all she wanted was a TV for the Today Show. That's all she wanted. Black and white TV, she was so excited. It was like 76, 77, something like that. So I've had I'll admit that's what that, but you bring up a point. But at the end of the day, I think over time, people know when you're speaking for yourself and when you're speaking for NBC. For some of us, I think there's some truth to that. Now, it's funny what you say about, I know how the Fox's Washington Bureau is filled with great journalists. Fox New York is the headquarters where all the opinion shows come out of. There's some opinion shows that come out of Fox DC, but the news guys and gals are in DC, like 80, 90% of them. So I am very familiar. I would take anything John Roberts said to the bank. What Fox will do sometimes, if you watch, they'll have different stories they cover. Don't forget, you have a bias, however you want to call it, or frankly, whatever. I don't see it as a bias per se. It is you're making a judgment. I make a judgment every day at 5 p.m., 2 p.m. on the West. I Meet the Press Daily of what I think are the stories that matter that day. Brett Baer makes that same judgment at 6 o'clock. And he may also decide well, I'm going to do this story because I know the audience is into that story, but it'll do it in a fact-based way. And we might do something like, well, our audience might do it, but we're going to do it in a fact-based way. So there's something, I'm mindful of that. I'll see and I'll be like, oh, I know why they did that story. They want to do the news side of it because they want to do an opinion thing on it later at night. And that can happen over there. So I am discerning in because I happen to know how that operation works. I know people over there, and all that. But I can tell you, I think that the Fox has a real challenge on their hands between their opinion side and news side. And what it really means, it's the Washington Bureau versus New York. And the Hannity thing it's divided them a lot. And it puts them in, because especially since who's the first guy to come after a network like ours when they think we have a conflict issue? And they've pounded and they're well aware that they have been proactively pounding other networks for years on various issues. And what they're sitting on is totally indefensible. And so I think and the fact that the executives sided with Sean. Look, I'm not going to tell you but I had a high profile internally issue with somebody who I thought was practicing politics on the air. This is a while ago. Let's just say the executive stood by the news side people, not the opinion side people. And that's an important message for your executives to say. And when they send the other message, okay, they've sent the message. And that I guarantee you has sent shivers down the spines of some of those journalists over there.
Last question from Tiana.
Okay, well, this is a short one. And I just have to ask because, so there was a tweet, I think yesterday.
Tell us where you're from.
Oh, where I'm from. I'm from Southern California.
Okay.
So
that really narrows it down.
Yeah, I mean, Orange County, LA, that border, the exact border.
That does, actually.
That does say something.
That does, yeah.
So still, yes, coastal media bubble. So there was a tweet yesterday by a Parkland shooting survivor that it went viral, so I kind of just have to ask your opinion of it, that said that the Sleepy Eyes nickname is anti-Semitic.
Oh, it's funny. I saw this. I saw this go viral. Believe it or not, a Washington Post reporter has made an inquiry to me about whether they're trying to research this. I don't know if any of you watch Seinfeld reruns. I've got to be careful here. That is a generational thing. Seinfeld has an Uncle Leo, and there's a joke in there. Oh, he thinks everything's anti-Semitic. And I say this like, my mother would see anti-Semitism in everything. God bless her. I love her. But she would be like, oh, everybody's always looking for my horns and my tail and all this stuff. And my mother's never even seen anti-Semitism in that. So I have a theory. One time, I've asked Trump where he came up with the nickname, and he goes, I don't remember, but once I pick a nickname, I stick to it. I have a theory, and it's a pretty simple theory how he came up with Sleepy Eyes. He watches a lot of NBC, because it's his home network, right? He worked there, as he tells me a lot. He paid my salary, so he claims, at The Apprentice. It's always funny. He still will bring that up. Anyway. I think I said something that made him upset, so he's a big DVR guy, he hits pause. You ever hit pause and you catch somebody's eyes and you're like, wow, that's funny, and you think that'd be a cool screenshot, my guess is I've seen it myself when you get a weird freeze that somebody in production will do. I think it's as simple as, I always say to myself, think like him. Think like Trump. Do we really think he researched yes, Sleepy Eyes. It was this 1933 secret society that he's well researched because he knows everything about the Third Reich? Or did he hit the pause button on his DVR? What do you think, right?
Right.
What's more likely?
That is the ultimate Occam's razor question.
Occam's razor, exactly. What's the simplest explanation?
Right. I know what it is. We will end on that. But thank you all for joining us and for your wonderful questions. Chuck, thank you so much for your time. And,
take his class. He's a really smart dude, I swear.
Thank you, Alan. Sweet. Thanks.